Welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar, Tips and Tricks for Installing SQL Server AlwaysOn. My name is Ginger Keys and I am a consultant with SQLRX. SQLRX is a division of Integrated Services Incorporated. And if you'd like more information about our company or our services, please visit our website. It's at SQLRX.com. Also, I will provide our contact information at the end of the presentation, and also this presentation will be available for download. Afterwards, we'll send you guys an email and let you know how to get to that. So today we are talking about AlwaysOn, which is a new feature of SQL Server 2012 and 2014. Really, it's the next evolution of database mirroring. In fact, it uses the existing technologies of database mirroring and failover clustering, and it has enhanced these features just to provide a really good layer of high availability and disaster recovery. To describe it real simply, what AlwaysOn is you've got your production databases on a primary server, and then you have several secondary servers that you're going to replicate your data over to. And these secondary servers are actually live copies of your databases. They're not just backup copies sitting over there. They're actual usable copies of your database, and you can use them for read-only tasks like reporting or some maintenance tasks. So it's a great feature. SQL 2012, you can have up to 4 secondaries, and in SQL Server 2014, you can have up to 7 secondaries. So today, we're going to discuss some basic information. We'll go over some terminology. We will look at some of the features of AlwaysOn. We will look at the prerequisites for an installation, and then we'll go over the steps for a real basic installation. So let's just get started, and we will start with the terminology. All right, availability group. This is a container for a set of databases. It's your group of databases that's going to fail over together. You can actually have more than one AlwaysOn availability group on your server as well. All right, replica is just another name for server. You can use them interchangeably, and I will try and refer to servers as replicas throughout the presentation. Availability group listener. This is just a virtual name that your end users are going to connect to in order to access a database on one of your secondary replicas. It's similar to a cluster name. So your end users will connect through a DNS connection to this listener, and then the listener points the end user to the correct replica with the appropriate rights. All right, synchronous and asynchronous. This is just a method of data movement. The way it works is, okay, with synchronous, your primary replica is going to send transactions over to your secondary replica, and it's going to wait for the secondary replica to harden the transaction to log before it moves on with the next task. So synchronous is a little bit slower because the primary is waiting on the secondary to harden the log, but your data is completely safe with synchronous. Now with asynchronous data movement, the primary sends transactions over to the secondary, but it doesn't wait for the secondary to harden the log. It just is going to move on to the next task without waiting. So it's quicker, but you do have the possibility of a little bit of data loss. So just those are just the two differences in those two methods of data movement. All right, when you set up your AlwaysOn group, when you configure it, you're going to tell it what type of connections each of your replicas will accept. And there are 3 rights that an end user client can connect with. Disallow connections. In the wizard, it just simply says no. This does not allow any end user to connect to the secondaries at all. Of course, your DBAs, your developers, your regular SQL users, they can connect directly just to the node. This is just for end user connections. All right, the read intent only lets the end users with this designation connect and it keeps everyone else out. And then allow all, in the wizard it just says yes. Allow all allows all of the end users to connect to those secondaries and get to the databases. Of course, they only have read-only access, but it doesn't keep anybody out. All right, let's move on and look at a simple illustration of an always-on availability group. Now, this is just one way that you could possibly configure your group. What I've done here is I've got one primary replica, and I've got 3 secondary replicas. Replica 1 is my primary replica over on the left side. This is my production machine. Okay, this is where all of the read-write operations are going to happen. Replica 2 is my secondary that I have set up to do reporting. Also, I've got synchronous data flow going to that machine. Replica 3 down at the bottom is my secondary that I have set up to perform maintenance tasks, maybe backups. Again, I have synchronous data flow going to that machine. And then over on the far right, replica 4, that's a secondary that I have got set up to do reporting again. And I've got asynchronous data flow going to that machine. Now, theoretically, in this scenario, my replica 4 over there on the right could be a server that is off-site from the main data center. Now, if that was the case, that would just provide, even further disaster recovery should something happen to the primary data center, should the power go out or something. You would have the live copy of your databases sitting over here on replica 4 ready to go. Anyway, just an illustration and just one possible way to set up a group. All right, we will move on to talk about some of the features. All right, AlwaysOn gives you combined high availability and disaster recovery. You've got live copies of your databases sitting on several secondary servers. And again, these are not just backup copies, but they're actual usable copies in read-only mode. Zero data loss protection. Now, this is going to depend on whether you use synchronous or asynchronous data movement. Because remember, with asynchronous data movement, like I said, it's possible you could have a small amount of data loss should a failure occur. All right, failover. Your databases will all fail over as a group. You can set up automatic or manual failover. And let me just mention, if you set up automatic failover, you must use synchronous data flow. If you've got asynchronous data flow set up, then failover is going to be manual. All right, local or shared storage. Shared storage is no longer a requirement like it is for failover clustering. And if you don't use shared storage, it just further removes the possibility for your SAN or your shared storage device being a possible point of failure. Automatic page repair is available with AlwaysOn. And active use of secondary servers. Now, this is one of the great new features of AlwaysOn, one of my favorite features. Your databases on your secondaries are available to use in read-only mode. You can do any of the read-only tasks. You can offload all of your reporting onto your secondaries. And you can do a lot of your maintenance tasks on your secondaries as well, like backups and integrity checks. And because you can offload some of these tasks onto your secondaries, the performance on your primary server is just going to be that much more enhanced because a lot of those operations sometimes can take up a lot of resources. All right, prerequisites for installation. This is important. SQL Server 2012 or 2014 Enterprise Edition on all of your replicas, and it must be installed as standalone instances. Now, of course, you can use Developer or Evaluation Edition, but for a production environment, you need to use Enterprise Edition. Standard Edition will not work. Licensing is a little different with AlwaysOn. For every active license that you purchase, you're allowed one free license. So let's take an example. Let's say you have one primary replica and 4 secondary replicas. So you have a total of 5 machines in your AlwaysOn group. So your first replica, you're going to need to purchase a license. Your second replica, you get a free license. Third replica, you'll have to purchase a license. Your fourth replica, you get a free one. And your fifth replica, you have to purchase a license. Now, that being said, I am no licensing expert, so this is just my understanding of it. Please contact your Microsoft rep or whoever handles your licensing to get further clarification on that, please. All right, Windows Server 2008 R2 Enterprise, at a minimum, must be installed on each replica. Let me make a very strong recommendation here that instead of 2008 R2, that you install Windows Server 2012. Now, 2008 R2, it will function with AlwaysOn, but there's a lot of issues and headaches associated with it. So if you can go on and install Windows Server 2012, you'll be much happier for it. All right, each replica must be in the same Windows domain. They have to be able to communicate with each other. And sufficient disk space on each replica. Now, you don't have to have identical hardware, but you do need to have sufficient disk space to hold all of your databases and to account for the growth of those databases. And on that same token, you need to have sufficient resources on each of your replicas to handle the same workload. Doesn't have to be identical hardware, but it's got to be able to handle the same amount of work. All right, databases may not use the same collation. I mean, they must use the same collation. Sorry about that. They cannot differ across the replicas. Got to use the same collation. None of your replicas can be running Active Directory. Your databases must be in full recovery mode. You need full backups taken of each database before you install AlwaysOn. And your SQL Service account needs to be a domain account. It's got to be able to access all of your replicas. So don't use the local machine service account. Make sure your SQL Service account is a domain account, and add this SQL Service account to your administrators group on each of your replicas. All right, that is it for the prerequisites. So let's get on and talk about the actual installation of AlwaysOn. Now, there are 5 steps. You need to do all these steps, and you need to do them in this order, and we'll go over each one of them individually. First, you need to add Windows Failover clustering to each of your replicas. Then you need to configure Windows Failover cluster on your primary replica. Then we'll configure SQL Server on all of the replicas. We'll make sure the logins are configured correctly. And then we finally will install and configure AlwaysOn availability group. So first step, add failover clustering to each replica. All right, on each machine, you need to open Server Manager, add roles and features, add failover clustering, and then click Install to get the wizard started. Now, when you get to the Select Features page, you want to select Failover Clustering, the checkbox to install that. And if you don't already have the .NET Framework 3.5.1 or greater, go on and install that as well. You'll proceed next through the wizard and then finally tell it install. Again, you need to do this on all of your replicas. Second step, we're going to configure Windows Failover Cluster. So I've gone to my primary replica. From Server Manager, we open Failover Cluster Manager. And then we want to click on Validate Configuration. And then this will open the wizard. Now, first thing, you want to add the names of your SQL servers that you want to configure as replicas in your AlwaysOn group. And then the next page in the wizard is the Testing Options page. On this one, you want to run all tests. You want to validate the configuration. And it's very normal to see some warning messages. So just expect to see some warning messages after you run your validation tests. And then after your validation tests are done, you will get to the access point for administering the cluster dialog box. Now, this is where you're going to enter your virtual cluster name and your virtual IP address. Now, this is not the name of your SQL Server. It's not the name of your instance. It's a cluster name, so just enter a cluster name there. You're going to proceed next through the wizard. Your cluster will be created, and your secondary nodes will be added to the cluster. Now, your virtual cluster should now show up on all of your other replicas, so you don't have to go through this step on the other machines. You should be all set now with setting up your cluster. All right, third step in installation is to configure SQL Server. Now, you're going to do this on all of your replicas. So you will open up the SQL Server Configuration Manager, and you want to expand the SQL Server network configuration. Click on the Protocols for MS SQL Server, and in the right panel there you should see the TCP IP entry. You want to right-click on that and enable it. While you're still in the SQL Server Config Manager, you want to go up to the SQL Server Services, right-click on that to open up the Properties dialog box, navigate to the Always-On High Availability tab, and enable Always-On. Now, you'll need to restart this SQL Server service after you make these changes. And again, do this on all of your replicas. All right, fourth step. We're going to make sure our logins are configured correctly. So if it is not already there, go on and add your SQL Service account as a new SQL login in Management Studio. You want to make sure all of your replicas allow remote connections. In Management Studio, you can either do this through the instance properties or you can do it through SP Configure, whichever you prefer. Most likely, you will have to adjust your Windows firewall because the replicas must be able to communicate with each other. And we're going to create a file share through Server Manager that the service account, SQL Service account, and the replicas can all access with read-write permissions. Now, this file share is what is going to be used to join your databases to the AlwaysOn group. It's for the initial backup and restore process. There are a couple of other methods you can use to join your databases to the AlwaysOn group, and I'll point those out to you here in just a few minutes. But we're going to use this method of creating a file share. Also, with your SQL Service account, make sure that it has connect permissions. So in Management Studio, just navigate to your SQL Service account, right-click and open the Properties dialog box and go to the Securables page, and you want to make sure the Connect SQL Grant box is checked. And do this on all of your replicas. Make sure it's got connect permissions on all of your replicas. All right. The last step, we're going to install and configure AlwaysOn availability groups. So we're going to make sure databases are in full recovery mode. We're going to make sure full backups have been taken of all of our databases. Also, these databases need to be removed from your T-log backup maintenance for the time being. You don't want the T-log backups running while we're trying to create the AlwaysOn group. You can add it back in after the fact. And again, make sure your SQL Service account is in the administrators group on each of your machines, each of your replicas. And again, it's got to be a domain account. Don't use that local machine service account. So after we have made sure all of this is in line and in order and taken care of, we're ready to open up Management Studio and start the installation. So from my primary replica, I'm going to expand the AlwaysOn High Availability folder, right-click on Availability Groups, and select New Availability Group Wizard to get it started. First page in the wizard, we want to specify our availability group name. I've called mine agroup_dev. Next page, we're going to select the databases to include in the group. Now, the databases listed on this page are going to be all of your databases that are in your instance. That doesn't mean you have to include all of them in your AlwaysOn group, but it's going to list every database that you have on your instance. And to the side of each of your databases, you're going to see a blue link that tells you whether the databases meet the prerequisites to be included or if they don't. And you can see one of mine doesn't. Now, if you can't tell what's wrong with the database just by the blue link description, you can actually click on your blue link, and a pop-up window will appear that explains to you what you need to do to fix it. So in this case, my database happened to be in bulk log recovery mode. So I stopped at this point, went back and corrected it, put it in full recovery mode, then it came back to this point in the wizard, and now you can see all of my databases meet the prerequisites. So I am including 2 of my databases in my AlwaysOn group, and I'm going to click Next, and the next page that we get to is the Specify Replicas page. Now, this is the page where you're going to connect your other machines or your other replicas to the AlwaysOn group, and you do that by clicking the Add Replica button. Now, for every replica that you add, you need to specify whether you're going to use automatic or manual failover, synchronous or asynchronous commit, and what type of access you're going to allow your end users. Now remember, this is the part we talked about in the terminology page where you can regulate if or how your end users can access the databases. So the disallow simply says no here in the wizard. That doesn't let any end users connect. Read intent only lets those users with that designation connect while it keeps everybody else out. And then allow all, which just says yes here in the wizard, allows all of the end users to connect. And again, they can only have read-only access, but it does set up how they can interact with these databases on these secondaries. Okay, and also on this page, notice that there are several tabs at the top. The second tab is the Endpoints tab. So we want to go to the Endpoints tab and make sure that the port number value is 5022. Let me just mention here, if there's more than one instance, you might need to create another endpoint for the additional instances to communicate. So, and I've provided a link at the end that gives a little more information on that. This third tab is the Backup Preferences tab. This is where you're going to choose where you want your backups to occur. The Backup Priority column lets you prioritize which replica will run backups. And let me just mention a few points about backups on secondaries. Copy-only full backups are allowed. Your log backups are allowed on more than one secondary, and they do form a single chain. And your differential backups are not supported at all. So be sure to give some thought to your backup strategy before you install an AlwaysOn group. All right, the last tab on this page is the Listener tab. And this is where you're going to enter the DNS name. You want to select the Create an Availability Group Listener. Enter your DNS name, which is your AlwaysOn listener name. It's the one used in the application connection string of your end users. You want to enter port 1433, and you want to enter your virtual IP address. Now this just needs to be any unused IP address on your network. If you need to, you can have your sysadmin or someone provide you with this beforehand. All right, next page in the wizard is the Select Initial Data Synchronization page. This page is where you add your databases to the group, to your AlwaysOn group. Now, we are using the full option, which is actually the Microsoft default option, which is fine. This is where we created the file share. But let me just recommend, if your databases are fairly large, you might want to use one of these other options, the join only or the skip, just because in these two options you run your backups, but you restore the databases yourself over on the secondaries. So it just saves you a little bit of time. But the full option's fine as well, and that's what we use. So we are going to browse to and select the shared folder that we set up earlier. And again, the SQL Service account and the replicas all have to have read-write access to the shared folder. We'll go next through the wizard and run the validations. You just want to verify that all your validations checks return successful results. Now, if you have any errors on this page, you need to stop at this point and go back and correct those before you move forward. Next is the summary page. And here we want to verify that all the configuration settings are correct, and we will click Finish. Now, at this point, the AlwaysOn group is being created. Your databases are being joined, your replicas are being joined, and you can look at the results here on this following page. Now, when it gets through, you want to verify that all your tasks have been completed successfully. I have gotten a warning on mine just because I did not set up a quorum when I created my failover cluster, and that's fine. It will not cause the installation to fail. So this was the last step of the wizard, and at this point, considering that all the tasks completed successfully, at this point we're finished. So we can take a look in Management Studio and see what it all looks like. All right, on my primary replica, I expand the AlwaysOn High Availability folder, and I can see my availability group there that I created, the A group dev. I can look at all the replicas that were joined. It tells whether they are primary or secondary. You can see my databases that have been joined. And also, I can see the listener that we created. Now, the end users who need to access these databases will have in their application connection string the name or the IP address of this listener. Also, you can have more than one availability group on your instance, like I mentioned before. Databases can only belong to one group at a time, but you can have more than one AlwaysOn group on your instance. Anyway, just an option. So let's talk about a couple of gotchas. I have run across a few myself. I'm sure I haven't discovered them all. But like I mentioned before, there are a lot of problems with Windows Server 2008 R2. I highly recommend Windows Server 2012 instead. You'll just avoid a lot of headaches by not doing the 2008 R2. Failover is not immediate. It can take a minute or two, and if it happens during production time, you're going to have a little bit of downtime. Scoping and sizing issues. Remember when I said you have to have enough disk space and enough resources on your secondary replicas to handle the size of the database, their growth, and also the workload. That can really come back and bite you if you don't have sufficient resources to handle the load. Logins and jobs, these do not fail over. They just don't. You need to have your logins and your jobs reproduced on every other replica. You can script these out, or you can use an SSIS package to move them over, but you need to have them on your secondary replicas waiting and ready to be activated in case of failover. They don't do it automatically. Monitoring is another gotcha. There is no out-of-the-box, straightforward monitoring process. There are a lot of good DMBs, there's some SQL alerts, there's new perfmon counters, and there's a dashboard. And all of these provide really good information. There's just no comprehensive monitoring process, though. You really do have to build your own. So all of these can present challenges, obviously, but they can be dealt with. You just got to be aware of it before deploying your AlwaysOn. Now, there are a lot of good sites and resources available, and I've listed a few here for you. And I've also listed some really good resources for just general information about AlwaysOn. So today we'll discuss some new terminology, some of the features and benefits. We looked at the prerequisites for installing, and then we went over the actual steps for installing. This presentation demonstrated a really basic installation of AlwaysOn. There's actually several variations you could use. AlwaysOn is a great new feature of SQL Server 2012 and 2014. It provides basically zero data loss protection and usable secondary servers, which is really awesome, I think. So I hope you get the chance to explore it further. And please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or comments about it. I would love to speak with you. I'm providing our contact information here. I invite you to visit our websites and follow us on social media. And if we can assist you with deploying your AlwaysOn environment, please let us know. We'd love to help out. Also, take advantage of our free SQL Health Check. It's fast, it's free, it's very insightful. It could really help you be proactive and find issues you didn't even know that were going on with your system. So, hope you've enjoyed the presentation today. This concludes our webinar. And again, thank you for attending.